It was the summer of 2019. I had just gone through a painful breakup after almost 6 years of living with someone I thought would be my forever. Work at the architectural firm had become unbearable too. The endless revisions, the missed deadlines, and the unrelenting hum of city life grinding me down until I couldn't tell if I was angry or just exhausted. My friends, the same group I'd gone camping with since college, had been trying to pull me out of that fog for months. When late July came around, they suggested we take another trip into the wild, just like old times. At first, I refused. I didn't have the energy, or maybe I didn't want to face my thoughts without the distractions of traffic and glowing screens. But they insisted. They said nature would heal me, that getting lost in the quiet of the woods might help me find myself again. After weeks of convincing, I gave in. We decided on Black Elk Ridge, a stretch of thick forest land in northern Wyoming that had been converted into a semi-official camping area years ago. It wasn't a famous national park or a well-known tourist spot, just a remote patch of wilderness with a single narrow road leading into it, far from gas stations and convenience stores. It had no cell phone coverage, no ranger cabins, and only one sign at the entrance that read, Black Elk Ridge, private land beyond. We knew it was technically restricted in parts, but we'd been there once before, back in 2014, when the boundaries weren't clearly marked. The memory of that trip was still vivid. The endless green hills, the deep scent of pine needles, the cold river cutting across the valley, and the way the stars looked almost alive in the night sky. I thought maybe that was what I needed again, to remember how small I was compared to the world. We left on a Friday morning, right before dawn, with the back of my truck packed to the roof with gear, tents, sleeping bags, propane burners, canned food, and coolers full of beer. The drive from Denver took nearly 8 hours, and for most of it, we rode in silence, the radio off, each of us lost in our own world. I remember staring out the window as the landscape changed, from the crowded highways to the open stretches of Wyoming plains, where the grass bent like waves under the wind. It was the kind of view that made you forget your phone existed. By the time we reached the turnoff to Black Elk Ridge, the sun was sinking behind the horizon, the sky painted with orange streaks fading into purple. The gravel road that led into the forest looked narrower than I remembered, its edges creeping closer with each mile as the trees leaned over the path, their branches clawing at the sides of the truck. I felt a strange mix of nostalgia and unease, like I was returning to a place I knew but didn't fully trust anymore. The further we went, the quieter it became. Even the sound of the engine seemed to dissolve into the stillness. When we finally reached the old clearing where we used to camp, it looked almost exactly the same. Open field surrounded by dense timber, a shallow creek running along the left edge, and a line of jagged rocks forming a kind of barrier on the far side. The only difference was the feeling. Back then, it had felt wild but inviting. Now, there was something in the air, something that made the skin on my arms tighten, like the forest was aware of us. We set up camp quickly, using the fading light to pitch 2 tents near the tree lean and stack firewood beside the creek. The air was cool but heavy with humidity, and the scent of wet soil clung to everything. I remember standing by the creek, staring at my reflection in the rippling water. My face looked unfamiliar, hollow eyes, rough stubble, and a weariness that ran deeper than I wanted to admit. That's when it hit me. This trip wasn't about fun. It was about escape. I had run from my apartment, my job, my thoughts, all in the hope that the wilderness could swallow them for me. As night fell, the forest came alive with small sounds, the clicking of insects, the rustle of wind through branches, the distant splash of something in the creek. It was peaceful, in that haunting way only true silence can be. We sat around the fire, eating kinchili and pretending everything was normal. I remember feeling a strange calm, then a brief moment when I thought maybe they were right. Maybe this was exactly what I needed. But something about that first night didn't sit right. I couldn't place it at first. It wasn't the temperature, or the noises, or even the darkness. It was the way the forest felt aware. The trees seemed to press closer the longer you stared at them, and the shadows between their trunks didn't move the way they should when the fire flickered. I remember waking up sometime around 3 in the morning, my skin cold with sweat, even though the air was still. The campfire had burned down to embers, and everything was drenched in a kind of darkness you only find far from civilization. I couldn't see the creek, or the tents, or the sky. Just black. For a few seconds, I lay still, unsure what had woken me. There was no sound, no wind, not even the chirping of crickets. That unnatural silence filled my ears, pressing down until I could hear my heartbeat echoing against my ribs. Then came a faint scent, something metallic, sharp, and out of place, drifting through the air like iron mixed with soil. It lasted only a few seconds before fading. I told myself it was nothing, probably the fire pit cooling, or a deer passing nearby. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back to sleep. That was the last peaceful night I would ever have at Black Elk Ridge, because the next day, the forest started changing in ways none of us could explain. When I woke the next morning, the air was damp and gray, the kind of foggy silence that makes everything feel slightly displaced, as if the world hasn't fully decided to wake up yet. My body ached from the uneven ground beneath the tent, and for a few moments, I just lay there, staring at the fabric above me, trying to remember why I'd agreed to come in the first place. There was that faint metallic smell again, though it was weaker this time, subtle enough that I could almost convince myself it wasn't there. When I finally crawled out, the clearing was cloaked in a thin mist rolling low along the grass, and the creek beside us sounded distant, muffled, as though the air itself was thicker than usual. The others were still asleep, their tents zipped shut. The fire pit was cold, filled with the gray remains of last night's wood, and the food cooler was half open, a sign that someone had gone looking for something during the night. I didn't think much of it then. We were all restless sleepers, and it wasn't unusual for someone to wake up craving water or needing to relieve themselves. Still, there was something about the scene, the half-open lid, the wet footprints in the dew leading toward the tree-lean, that made my stomach tighten with an uneasy curiosity. I walked over to the creek, crouching to splash cold water on my face. The shock of it cleared my head, but what really caught my attention was the faint discoloration in the current, brownish streaks that looked like rust dissolving in the water. I dipped my hand in, thinking maybe it was just sediment stirred up from the bottom, but the smell that rose from it reminded me too much of blood for comfort. I tried to shake off the thought. It was early, and my mind was still half dreaming. The wilderness always had strange ways of playing with your senses, especially when you were far from anything familiar. By mid-morning, the fog lifted, revealing the ridge lines in the distance. We started cooking breakfast on the portable stove, laughing lightly at how quiet the night had been. Yet there was something off about the quiet. The forest around us felt still, too still. No birds, no buzzing insects, not even the wind brushing through the leaves. It was as though every living thing had gone silent at once. I remember glancing toward the woods behind our tents and feeling an irrational sense that we weren't alone, though there was no movement, no sound, no proof. We decided to hike deeper into the forest later that morning. There was an old dirt trail we discovered years ago, barely visible, that wound down toward the valley below where the creek widened into a shallow lake. We thought it would be fun to explore again, to relive that sense of adventure we used to have. The air smelled faintly of pine and wet earth, the kind of scent that usually brought peace. But as we followed the trail, I noticed strange things. Small piles of stones arranged in unnatural stacks beside the path, bits of charred half buried in the soil, and occasional trees with deep gashes across their bark, as though something heavy had been dragged along them. About an hour into the hike, We found a clearing that didn't exist the last time we were there. The trees were thinner, the ground covered in patches of moss and half-burned logs. And in the center stood what looked like the remnants of an old hunting post, 2 upright wooden beams and a crossbar between them, almost like a crude frame. It was weathered, half-rotten, and covered in moss. I remember staring at it and feeling that same faint metallic scent drifting again through the breeze, stronger this time, unmistakable. It was the same smell I'd noticed by the creek, only heavier now. Like the air itself carried traces of decay. We left that area quickly, but the silence followed us, and by the time we returned to camp, the sun had dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the clearing. Something had changed in the atmosphere again. The forest no longer felt empty. It felt aware. The trees stood motionless, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something beyond them was watching us, something that knew we didn't belong. That night, as the fire crackled weakly, I found myself staring into the dark line of trees across the creek. The others had gone quiet, lost in their own thoughts, and the conversation that once felt comforting now felt forced, like we were all pretending not to feel what we felt. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. People talk about the wilderness playing tricks on your mind, how isolation and darkness can make you imagine things that aren't there. But there's a difference between imagination and instinct, and my instincts were screaming that something was wrong. The unease grew worse when the wind began to shift. It wasn't strong, just a faint stirring that made the tent fabric ripple slightly. But mixed in with it came a sound, not loud, but sharp enough that I froze. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. More like the faint, rhythmic scrape of something against stone. It came from somewhere near the creek, repeating at uneven intervals, then stopping, then returning again. None of us spoke. We just listened, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sound seemed to move, as if circling the perimeter of the clearing. Eventually, it stopped, just as suddenly as it had begun. The forest went still again, and though we tried to laugh it off, no one dared to go near the creek that night. I went to sleep late, lying awake long after everyone else had drifted off. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faint shimmer of the water, the ghostly white of the fog curling across it, and something darker moving beneath the surface, something that wasn't reflected by the moonlight. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke suddenly to a cold draft passing through the tent. My first thought was that the zipper had come undone, but when I reached for the flap, it was fully sealed. The cold wasn't coming from outside. It was seeping from the ground beneath me, rising like damp air. I pressed my palm against the floor of the tent and felt the fabric trembling slightly, as if something heavy had moved underneath the soil. My heart started pounding. I held my breath, listening. Then came that faint metallic scent again, stronger than ever, thick and coppery, coating the back of my throat. I stayed still for what felt like hours, too afraid to move. When morning finally came, the air was warmer again, and the sensation had vanished. But outside the tent, near the fire pit, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were fresh prints in the dirt. Bare footprints, human-shaped but elongated, as though the toes had dug deeper than normal, like whoever or whatever made them had been dragging its weight forward. The prints led from the creek to the fire pit, then vanished into the trees. We all saw them. None of us said a word. That day the forest didn't just feel different, it looked different. The light filtered through the canopy in strange ways, giving everything a muted green tint, and the trail weed followed the day before it was gone, swallowed by the undergrowth as though it had never existed. Even the air felt thicker, harder to breathe. Every so often, I thought I heard something behind us, soft, uneven footsteps keeping pace just beyond sight. Each time I turned around, there was nothing but the whisper of leaves swaying gently, mocking my paranoia. By afternoon, tension had settled between us like fog. We barely spoke, each pretending to be busy with small tasks, collecting wood, checking the tents, cleaning the cooking gear. But I could see it in their faces. They felt it too. That unspoken fear that something out there knew we were here and was waiting. That evening, the forest refused to go quiet. The air carried strange noises, rustling branches, distant splashes, and what sounded like faint tapping against rock. It wasn't natural wildlife movement. It had a rhythm, a slow, deliberate cadence, as though someone, or something, was mimicking sound for the sake of being heard. The night that followed would change everything, because when I woke again, sometime around 2 a.m, the fog had returned, thick and motionless, and through it, by the creek, I saw something standing. It wasn't moving. It wasn't human. It was simply there. I don't think I'll ever forget the way the fog looked that night. It wasn't the thin, silvery mist that gently drifts across a cold morning. It was thick, heavy, almost solid, the kind that seems to swallow sound and light at the same time. When I woke, it took me a few seconds to understand where I was, to remember that I was still inside the tent. The air was colder than before, almost damp enough to sting my skin, and every breath I took came out in shallow clouds that hung for too long before fading. There was no noise from the other tents, no breathing, no movement, no rustle of fabric, just that deep silence pressing down from all directions. It was so complete that I could hear the faint pulse of blood in my ears, the steady rhythm of my heartbeat pounding like a drum. I don't know what made me unzip the flap and step outside, but something did, some quiet pull, as if the forest itself was holding its breath and waiting for me to look. The fog stretched across the clearing like a blanket of smoke, pale gray against the darker silhouettes of the trees. The fire pit was cold again, just a dull scatter of ashes. And there, beyond it, beside the creek, stood a shape that didn't belong. It wasn't moving. It wasn't clear either, just a tall, black figure, darker than the fog, darker than the night itself. I couldn't make out features. No face, no clothes, no edges that made sense. It was just a shadow, standing upright where no shadow should be. My first thought was that it had to be one of my friends, maybe up early, but the stillness was wrong. Whoever, or whatever, it was stood absolutely motionless, as if frozen in place. I stared for what felt like minutes, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light. But then the fog shifted slightly, and for the briefest moment, I saw something that turned my blood cold. The figure's head tilted, not smoothly, not naturally, but in a slow, jerking movement, as though the motion didn't belong to a living thing. It turned toward me, though there were no eyes to see, and even from that distance, I felt a wave of something pass through the air, a pulse of dread that hit me in the chest and left me trembling. I stumbled back into the tent, pulling the zipper closed with shaking hands, my heart hammering so hard I thought the sound alone would wake the others. I waited in the dark, counting seconds, listening for footsteps, for movement, for anything. But there was nothing, only silence. Slowly, I forced myself to breathe again. One slow inhale, one shaky exhale, over and over until exhaustion finally pulled me under. When I opened my eyes again, it was daylight. The fog was gone. The creek shimmered under the morning sun as if nothing had happened. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined everything, that my mind had created something out of exhaustion and fear. But then I noticed the ground. Right where the figure had been standing, the grass was flattened, not burned or broken, just pressed down in a perfect oval. The soil beneath it was darkened, damp with something that looked like water, but smelled faintly of that same metallic scent that had followed us since the first night. The others were awake by then, though no one spoke much. The air between us was strained, stretched thin by something none of us wanted to acknowledge. When I asked if anyone had been outside during the night, they all shook their heads. I didn't press further. Somehow, I knew I wouldn't get an answer that would make sense. The day passed slowly. We busied ourselves with meaningless chores, collecting firewood, boiling water, pretending to enjoy the sunlight that filtered weakly through the trees. But the unease never left. It clung to us like humidity. Every few minutes, one of us would glance toward the tree-line or the creek, as if expecting something to emerge. Nothing did, but the silence remained unnatural. The forest still refused to speak. By afternoon, clouds began to form overhead, thick and bruised with the promise of rain. The air grew heavy, and a distant rumble rolled through the valley. We decided to secure the camp in case of a storm, tightening the tents, covering the firewood, checking the ropes. As I worked, I kept catching glimpses of movement just beyond the trees, small, darting shapes that disappeared the moment I tried to focus on them. At first, I thought they were animals, but the more I looked, the more I realized the shapes were upright, too tall, too slow in their movement to be anything with four legs. The storm never broke. The clouds lingered until nightfall, low and swollen, but not a drop of rain fell. By the time the sky went dark again, I could feel a dull ache forming in my chest, the kind that comes when you know something bad is waiting just beyond sight. The fire crackled weakly, barely holding against the damp air. It was just past midnight when the first sound came. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against bark, coming from somewhere near the edge of camp. We all froze. The sound came again, closer this time, moving slowly along the tree-line, circling. The light from the fire reached only a few feet into the dark, and beyond that was nothing but black. I could feel my heartbeat quicken, my hands gripping the edge of my chair until my knuckles ached. Then the smell returned, stronger than ever. Metallic, sharp, impossible to ignore. It flooded the air until it coated the back of my throat. I saw one of the others glance toward the creek, eyes wide, lips pressed tight, and I knew they smelled it too. The sound stopped. The forest went silent again. For a long time, none of us moved. The fire cracked once, sending up a thin stream of sparks that drifted into the dark. Then, from the direction of the creek, came a low, dragging noise. Not footsteps, something heavier, slower, moving through the wet earth. It scraped and slid, like something pulling its weight forward with effort. I wanted to move, to grab my flashlight, to do something, but I couldn't. My body refused to listen. The dragging continued for several minutes, moving closer, until it sounded like it was right on the other side of the fire pit. The smell was suffocating now. My vision blurred with panic. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was the kind of silence that made you aware of your own pulse, your own breath, the creak of your joints as you tried not to move. Minutes passed, maybe more, and then the fog rolled in again. It started near the creek, curling low across the ground, pale and slow, creeping toward the tents. The firelight caught it, turning it a faint orange, and through that haze, I saw movement, a shape stepping forward, the same one I'd seen the night before. Only this time, it wasn't still. It moved slowly, with a dragging limp, as though its legs didn't work right. Its body was tall, its shoulders unnaturally broad, and where its face should have been, there was only darkness. I couldn't tell if it was wearing something, or if its skin itself was that black void. Each step it took made the ground seem to sink slightly beneath it. The others saw it too. I could feel their fear radiating through the air. No one breathed. The figure stopped near the creek, head tilted slightly toward us, unmoving again. And then it was gone. Not in the sense that it walked away, just gone. One moment there, the next moment, the fog rippled, and it was no longer standing there. The air lightened. The smell began to fade, and the only sound left was the faint ripple of water. We sat there until dawn, too afraid to move, too unsure of what we'd just seen. When daylight came, the fog was gone once more, but the footprints were back. Long, deep impressions leading from the creek to the edge of our fire pit, then turning sharply back toward the woods. And near one of the tents, half buried in the dirt, was a piece of fabric. It was torn, faded, and soaked through with something dark. When I picked it up, I realized it wasn't ours. Morning light should have felt like safety, but it didn't. It fell across the clearing in thin streaks, filtered through mist and hanging branches, but the warmth I expected never came. Everything was damp, the tents, the grass, even the air itself. When I stepped outside, the world felt muted, as though all the colors had been washed away overnight. I could still smell the faint metallic tang lingering in the air, weaker than before, but enough to make me nauseous. The piece of fabric I'd found earlier still lay where I dropped it, half buried in the soil beside one of the tents. It was old, torn at the edges, darkened by water and time, and faintly sticky when I touched it again. I noticed faint stitching near the corner, the remains of a logo, something that looked like Ridge Supply Company. The name didn't ring a bell, but the fabric didn't look modern. It was thick canvas, the kind you'd find on old military duffels or hiking packs from decades ago. Nobody wanted to talk about the night before. The others looked tired, drawn, and pale. We avoided each other's eyes, each pretending to be busy with something. When someone finally muttered that it was probably time to leave, the suggestion hung in the air, heavy and unspokenly agreed upon. But leaving wasn't as simple as it sounded. The trail we came in on, the same narrow road we'd driven through 2 days earlier, was gone. At first, I thought we'd made a wrong turn. The path should have been visible from the far edge of the clearing, a faint line of pressed soil between the trees. But when we walked out to check, there was nothing, just solid forest, thick with undergrowth and damp ferns. No tire tracks, no flattened grass. No hint that a truck had ever driven through here. I followed the tree line, pushing through branches and low shrubs until I found what looked like an opening, but it ended abruptly in a wall of thorns. We tried to retrace our steps from memory, east toward the ridge, where the land dipped, but every direction led us back into the same pattern of trees. It was like walking in circles, though we hadn't turned. Every 20 or 30 feet, the landscape repeated itself. Same moss-covered trunks, same hollowed stump, same faint smell of wet metal in the air. By mid-morning, the frustration turned into fear. No one said it aloud, but it was there in the silence between us. The forest wasn't behaving normally. We decided to mark trees with a knife, carving small notches as we moved. After 20 minutes, one of us pointed out that the same marked tree appeared twice, though we'd walked in a straight line. That was when panic started creeping in. We returned to camp, exhausted and uneasy, hoping that daylight might help us reorient. I tried using the compass on my watch, but the needle spun aimlessly, twitching like it couldn't find north. I tapped the glass, shook the watch, even removed the strap. Same result. That's when I realized something else. Not just the compass, but everything felt slightly off. The air seemed thicker, as if it carried weight. The trees appeared to lean closer the longer you looked at them. Even the light didn't behave right. It shifted unnaturally, moving slower than the sun's path should allow. We sat in silence for hours, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The only sound was the faint trickle of the creek. I remember staring at the water, thinking about the figure I'd seen there, and how it had seemed so aware of me. Every time the wind blew across the clearing, I caught that faint metallic smell again, and it made me think of blood in the soil, as if the land itself was bleeding. Sometime around mid-afternoon, one of us, Tyler, said he was going to try climbing the ridge. It wasn't high, maybe a few hundred feet, but from the top, we should have been able to see the highway or the old road that led in. I wanted to go with him, but he insisted he'd be faster alone. He packed a small bag with water and a flashlight, then started up the slope. We watched him until the trees swallowed him. The forest was quiet again, except for the low hiss of the wind moving through the branches. An hour passed, then two. By the third hour, the light had started fading, and still, no sign of Tyler. We tried shouting his name, but the sound didn't carry right. It echoed strangely, bouncing off unseen walls, fading before it reached the distance. There was no response, just silence. When night fell, the fog returned, thicker than before, swallowing the edge of the clearing. It moved with purpose now, curling through the grass and around the tents. The temperature dropped sharply, and the smell came back, that same metallic stench, sharper, denser, as if the air itself was rotting. We gathered near the fire, trying to keep it alive. I couldn't stop staring toward the ridge where Tyler had gone. The fog drifted higher along its slope, turning the trees into black silhouettes. Every so often, I thought I saw a movement, something shifting between the trunks, slow and deliberate, like it was descending. Then came a sound. It started faintly, barely audible, the soft, wet rhythm of something dragging along the ground. It came from the direction of the ridge, echoing through the fog, slow and uneven. None of us moved. The sound grew louder, closer, accompanied by a faint scraping noise, like stone grinding against metal. When the figure appeared, it came through the fog without shape at first, a shadow within a shadow, tall and uneven, moving with that same dragging limp I'd seen before. But this time, there was something different about it. Something was slung over its shoulder. At first, I thought it was just a dark mass, maybe a branch or debris. But when it stepped closer, the firelight flickered enough for me to see. It wasn't debris. It was Tyler. He hung limp, his clothes torn, his skin pale and wet, his arms dangling lifelessly. The thing carrying him didn't look human. It was tall, too tall, its limbs impossibly long, its movements jerky like a puppet being pulled by strings. Its head tilted again, that same unnatural motion I'd seen before, and it paused just beyond the glow of the firelight. No one moved. No one spoke. The air felt like it had frozen. The figure stood there for several seconds, then dropped Tyler to the ground with a dull, heavy sound that echoed through the clearing. It didn't turn or run. It simply sank backward, fading into the fog like smoke dissolving in wind. We couldn't move for a long time. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my own breathing and the faint ripple of the creek. When we finally reached Tyler, he was cold. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. His skin had that same faint metallic smell clinging to it, as if the scent had seeped into him. There were no visible wounds, no signs of an attack, but his lips were dark, almost blue, and when I touched his wrist, his veins felt like they'd hardened. We covered him with a tarp, unable to process what had just happened. No one spoke. The forest around us seemed to lean closer, listening. That night, no one slept. The fire burned low, casting long, shivering shadows across the tents. I sat there, staring at the edge of the fog, waiting for it to move again. But it didn't. Not yet. The next morning arrived with a dull, cold mist that hung heavy over the lake. It wasn't fog like you'd see in town. It was thicker, damp, the kind that clung to your skin and made every breath feel like you were inhaling wet cloth. The fire pit was cold, filled with white ash, and I could see that something, or someone, had walked near it during the night. The prints were smeared, elongated, and unlike any boot marks we had made the day before. I tried convincing myself that maybe a raccoon had dragged its paw through the dirt, but deep down I knew those weren't animal tracks. They were too large, too strangely shaped, and pressed too deep into the soft ground. When I went down to the lake to refill my water bottle, I noticed something else. The shoreline was disturbed, as if something had come up from the water during the night. The pebbles and weeds were shifted in a circular shape, as though a body had dragged itself out and then returned. There was a faint trail that led back into the lake, a path of disturbed sediment that disappeared into the still water. I stood there for a long time, my heart tightening with that cold fear that comes when the world feels suddenly wrong. The silence of the morning only made it worse. No birds, no insects, just the soft whisper of the water. Later that day, while Daniel cooked breakfast, I found his tent zipper open again. He swore he had closed it tightly before sleeping, and even added a small clip to keep it sealed, but now the clip lay in the dirt beside the flap. Inside, his sleeping bag was damp, and his flashlight, which he'd left next to his pillow, was missing. We both searched the area, thinking it had rolled out or he misplaced it, but when we finally found it, it was lying near the lake, half submerged, covered in a slick film of black mud. I remember lifting it by its strap and seeing the lens cracked, as if someone had stepped on it. That day dragged on with an uneasy weight. We avoided talking about what was happening, pretending everything was fine, but both of us were quieter than usual. Daniel tried to fish again, but after a few minutes he gave up and sat silently staring at the water, lost in thought. I spent the afternoon chopping wood, though I didn't really need to. I just needed the noise, something to fill the emptiness that seemed to surround us. Every now and then I thought I saw shapes moving between the trees across the lake. Not people exactly, but shadows, pale against the dark green, moving too smoothly, too slowly. When the sun went down, we built a larger fire than before, almost as if we believed the light could keep us safe. The air was colder that night, and a thin wind blew from the direction of the lake, carrying a faint smell of rot, like fish left too long in the sun. I try not to think about it, but the stench seemed to grow stronger as the night deepened. Around midnight, I got up to relieve myself and wandered a few yards from the camp. When I turned back toward the fire, I saw something standing near the water. It wasn't Daniel. He was sitting by the fire with his head lowered. This thing was closer to the shoreline, tall and still, with a faint shimmer like wet skin reflecting the flames. It was facing the lake, unmoving, almost as if it were studying the reflection of the fire in the water. I froze. My first instinct was to shout, but something in my gut told me not to make sound. I just stood there, watching, trying to understand what I was seeing. The figure slowly crouched down and began to move its hands through the water, stirring it gently, almost tenderly. The ripples spread outward, glimmering red from the firelight. Then, as if sensing me, it turned its head, not its body, just its head, and looked in my direction. Even from a distance, I saw the shine of its eyes. They weren't glowing like in movies or stories, just reflecting light, but the reflection seemed wrong, like glass eyes that didn't blink. I backed away slowly, keeping my steps as silent as I could, and slipped back toward the tent. I didn't tell Daniel what I'd seen. I just lay down and stared at the roof of my tent, unable to close my eyes. Hours later, I thought I heard something brushing against the side of the tent, soft, deliberate, as though someone were dragging their fingers along the fabric. Then came a faint, dripping sound, like water hitting the ground right outside. It went on for what felt like forever, until just before dawn, when everything finally went quiet again. When morning came, Daniel looked exhausted, his eyes bloodshot and his hands trembling slightly. He said he hadn't slept either, claimed he kept hearing something moving outside all night. We both agreed not to talk about it, but the silence between us was heavier than ever. Something was out there, something that didn't belong, and both of us knew we were being watched. That day, we considered leaving, but Daniel insisted we stay one more night to rest before hiking back. I didn't argue, though everything inside me screamed to go. The air had grown colder, the woods quieter, and the smell near the lake had turned almost unbearable. That night would be the one that finally broke me. That final night came with an unnatural stillness, as if the entire forest had been holding its breath. The air was so cold that when I exhaled, the mist from my breath hung around me like smoke. The lake reflected nothing. It had gone completely black, a flat void stretching out behind our tents. Even the wind that used to move through the pines had died. It was so quiet that the smallest sound felt intrusive, as though it might wake something that had been waiting. Daniel and I built the largest fire yet, stacking the logs until the flames reached several feet high. The light gave a false sense of safety, but I could feel that something was different about that night. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was expectation, like the forest itself was aware we were leaving and didn't want to let us go. I tried focusing on small things, keeping my gear packed, making sure my knife was in my pocket, my flashlight beside me. But my hands wouldn't stop trembling, and my mind kept replaying the image of that figure by the lake, its face gleaming in the firelight, its stillness almost human, but not quite. Around midnight, the smell returned, thick, rotten wet. It drifted in waves from the water, wrapping around the campsite like a cold hand. Daniel muttered something about checking the lake, but before he could move, we both heard it. Slow, heavy splashes echoing across the shore. Something large was moving through the shallows, coming closer. The sound of it was measured, deliberate, each step pushing through the water as though it was wading straight toward us. We both grabbed our flashlights, but when we shined them toward the lake, the beams stopped short at the fog rolling along the surface. The mist seemed to swallow the light completely. Then, faintly, I saw movement, a tall shadow rising from the waterline, its outline broken, jagged, glistening with what looked like slick moss and dripping mud. I could hear the sound of water hitting the rocks as it stepped out of the lake, slow and unhurried, as if it knew there was no point in rushing. Daniel panicked first. He grabbed his pack and shouted for us to run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at the thing that had emerged from the water. It didn't walk like a person. It shifted, unbalanced, as though its limbs didn't bend correctly. When the firelight finally caught it, I saw its skin, grayish, torn in patches like flesh left too long in the cold. Parts of it shimmered with moisture, and something about its head seemed misshapen, its jaw hanging too low, almost unhinged. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring, but Daniel's scream broke whatever trance I was in. We ran. We didn't look back. We didn't grab the tent or the food. We just ran through the woods, tripping over roots, tearing through branches, our flashlights cutting through the dark like frantic beacons. But even over the noise of our footsteps and breathing, I could hear it. Something behind us, moving fast, steady, never stumbling. The ground was soft and wet underfoot, and every few seconds I felt the vibration of something heavy following close behind. When we reached the tree line near the edge of the campground, I turned around just once. The fire was still visible through the trees, flickering wildly, but something else caught my eye. There were footprints in the mud behind us, large, deep impressions, spaced far apart, as if made by something with an unnatural stride. They led straight from the lake to where we had been standing, and then followed our path into the woods. The shape of them wasn't human. The toes were long, splayed, the heel almost triangular, and the prints seemed to sink deeper than they should have, as if whatever had made them weighed far more than it looked. We didn't stop running until the sky began to lighten. When we finally reached the dirt road that led back toward town, we collapsed beside Daniel's truck, gasping for air. He was pale, shaking, muttering that he had seen it reach for him, that something cold had brushed his back as we fled. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was blank, my body numb. When we finally drove away, neither of us looked back. The forest disappeared behind us, swallowed by distance and morning fog. I remember feeling relief, but it was thin, fragile, the kind that doesn't last. We said nothing during the entire drive home. A week later, Daniel stopped returning my calls. When I finally went to his apartment, it was empty. His landlord said he'd moved out suddenly, leaving most of his things behind. I try not to think about it, but that same night, when I sat alone in my apartment, I noticed something. My hiking boots, which I left by the door since that trip, were still damp inside. Wet, as though I had just walked out of the lake. The smell of rot lingered faintly in the air. I threw the boots away the next morning, but that didn't help, because sometimes, especially late at night when it rains, I still hear it. The slow dripping sound of water near my